Welcome to TESOL 2250. We're going to go over a little bit about phrasal verbs today, or multi-word verbs, and then we'll talk about expanding verb phrases. So we've been talking about our various different kinds of verb formulae for, VL versus VT versus VG, VC, VI, all of those different verb types, B. And remember that your verbs our verb plus a slot is what we call a sentence nucleus, right? So you can kind of predict what kind of verb you have based on the number of slots before or after. And the same thing is also true if you're not sure what kind of verb you have. You can look at the various slots before and after, and you can kind of figure out what verb it is. So for example, we know that if we're looking at a linking verb, you're going to have a noun phrase subject, then the linking verb, and then you're going to have maybe a adjective phrase predicate adjective or noun phrase predicate noun. With a noun phrase, with a VT, we're going to have a noun phrase subject before that VT, and then a noun phrase direct object after that. So we see two slots that are obligatory. Now you can think again at the VG and the VC, and you'll notice that we have something before, and then we have two things after, right? And so only VG and VC are going to fall into that paradigm. And I'll let you recall what those two slots are that need to be filled with the VG and the two slots that need to be filled with the VC. But either way, that helps us narrow it down when we're trying to figure out what type of verb we have. If we see two slots, then we're going to have either a VG and a VC or a VC. And those slots are obligatory to make the sentence complete. So if you try to take one away and the sentence doesn't work anymore, then you know you're dealing with either a VG or a VC. Now, it's important to note, just as we saw with nouns and adjectives and things like that, that just like those, verbs can actually change their type depending on the sentence context. That is that you may have a verb that's a VT in one context, but maybe it's a VG in the other, as we saw with the verb send in the previous week. So let's take a look at a few examples here. So let's say we have the sentence, the president looked weary. Well, in this case, you might think, all right, well, what's the verb type here? Weary looks like an adjective. And in this case, this would be, it's like we're saying the president equals weary. Look isn't really doing very much to us. It doesn't have much semantic meaning behind it. So we would guess that look in this case is probably a VL, right? And that weary is the predicate adjective that comes after it to link to president. However, now let's say we have the president looked toward the reporters. Now this one is a little bit interesting because in this case, now the verb look actually does seem to have a lot of meaning associated with it. It's the action of moving one's head and facing one's gaze at something. And specifically, where are we facing our gaze? Toward the reporters. So in this case, it looks like the president looked toward the reporters. Look in this context is actually functioning as a VI. And so, because we can just say the president looked. Where did he look? Toward the reporters. Now that toward the reporters is a prepositional phrase functioning as an adverb of direction. Now here again, we have the verb writes. Toni Morrison writes exquisitely. Now in this case, exquisitely looks like an adverb. And the only thing that can take an adverb immediately after it is a VI. So we can say Toni Morrison writes, period. How does Toni Morrison write? The answer, exquisitely. So exquisitely is a true adverb. It's just telling us about how Toni Morrison writes. But in this case, we've got a VI. Let's see. Now, in this case, writes is taking a different verb form. Toni Morrison writes lyrical novels. Now here, we have this lyrical novels, looks like a noun, and that means that writes is going to be a VT if it takes a noun, phrase, direct object immediately afterward. So if it would be inappropriate to just say Toni Morrison writes and then just leave it at that, because we're expecting a something in this case, and that's exactly what we got with lyrical novels. So it has to be a VT in this context. So again, the verb itself does not have a type when it's in isolation, right? You can't necessarily say, well, writes in some contexts are going to be a VI, so I'm just going to always label it a VI. No, we have to always look at the sentence context to know the verb type, just as we did with parts of speech. Okay, so now we have some phrasal verbs. Actually, we have a lot of phrasal verbs in English. These are very common. This is when you have two or more words that come together and function as a single verb constituent. So let's look at the sentence here. Gerald Ford took on the presidency after Nixon's resignation. Well, in this case, took on is actually functioning as a single unit. It means to, sort of take command of something, to take on. Now, in this case, you might be tempted to look at on and think, oh, that looks like a preposition. However, we're not saying Gerald Ford took on the presidency. No, it seems like on kind of goes with take. It kind of goes in the opposite direction. It doesn't seem to link or be attached to the noun phrase that comes after it, like most prepositions would be with the object of the preposition noun phrase after it. So in this case, take on is actually, given its own meaning, and it has to be both of those words together to get that meaning. So we would say that in this case, we have a two-word transitive verb, because we can test to see whether a phrasal verb is transitive by making it passive. I can say the presidency was taken on by Gerald Ford after Nixon's resignation. And here we've made it passive, and it still works. So that on travels with take. It does not become separated from take. So we know that those two things function as a unit. And phrasal verbs are ubiquitous in English. Okay, we've got tons of them, like beat up and pulled off, back up, crack up, take on, like we saw earlier. And you'll notice that almost all of these things, have what looks like a preposition after it. Well, when it's in the context of a phrasal verb, it's no longer a preposition. It's what we call a verb particle. It goes along with the verb. So historically, these were prepositions, and they were analyzed along with the noun phrase that came after them as one unit in a prepositional phrase. But over time, grammar shifts and grammar changes, and now they're no longer analyzed as a preposition separately from the verb. And the interesting thing about phrasal verbs is that they take on a synergistic meaning, meaning that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So, for example, let's take crack up. We're not literally cracking up, right? This means to laugh really hard, to enjoy something. So we're not taking the meaning of each word, crack and up, literally. We just know as English speakers that when you put those two things together, that means to laugh out loud. And, this is something that phrasal verbs are very difficult for English language learners, precisely because they cannot predict the meaning of many of them based on the individual units of the phrasal verb. They're just something that you have to memorize. So you can have phrasal verbs of any type, a VI, a VT, VL, VC, and so on and so forth. The most common ones that you're going to see are VIs and VTs. But let's look at some intransitive phrasal verbs, some VIs. Here we have the silo blew up, okay? Now again, the meaning of blow up doesn't mean blow up. No, that's not what it means. It means to explode. The defendant broke down after the verdict. So that does not literally mean break and down. It just means to cry and be very emotional. The jet took off. Okay. So again, these look like prepositions, up, down, off, but they're not. They are verb particles. And we know that these are intransitive verbs, the whole phrase, or the phrasal verb, because they can end the sentence as they do here. Now, all of these things can, like any other VI, be followed by an adverb directly. The defendant broke down quietly after the verdict. The jet took off loudly, and so on and so forth. So again, we're not going to label these as prepositions in our trees. We're going to label the whole structure as whatever verb type it is. And I'll show you how to do that when we get into class on Friday. Remember that to contrast a verb particle with a preposition, prepositions make constituents with the noun phrase that comes after it. So if we take this up the stairs phrase, notice that the stairs is the object of the preposition, and it's housed underneath the prepositional phrase, and it's required. It's the object of the preposition because it's required by the preposition. Verb particles, however, make constituents with verbs and not with the noun phrase that comes after. So if, for example, I say the senator called up the president, to call up means to call casually. And here, that's where we have a phrasal verb. Now this is a VT, call up, because it's followed by the president. Now let's contrast that with the senator called up the stairs. Now we'll notice here, in this instance, up is definitely a preposition. Where did the senator call? Up the stairs. Now here, what we have is call is just a VI. Up the stairs is extra adverbial information. So once again, if we want to test these two things to see what type of verb we have, we can use the passive test. So let's say, for example, I want to try to use the passive test on the senator called up the president. Now, let's try to make that passive. We said earlier that this is probably a VT, but we have to test it. So I can say, the president was called up by the senator. Well, that makes perfect sense. On the other hand, we can't take a VI, the senator called up the stairs, and make it passive, right? I don't even know what that would be. Up the stairs. Oh, the stairs. I don't even know. The stairs were called up by the senator. Anyway, I can't even make that passive. So the point is that that is definitely a call is definitely a single word, and it's a VI in this context. So now when we get into class on Friday, we're going to start working on expanding our verb phrases, and we're going to indicate the status of the verb. Now, what does status mean? Well, verbs actually carry a lot of information, and that's why we focus all of our sentence types on the verb, because a verb, as we already know, can express tense, past, and present on the verb. It can also, in some contexts, express something called mood, which is different purposes for communicating. We'll get into what that is in more detail next week. Verbs, when they have auxiliary verbs, can also express something called aspect, which is a part of the verb's action. Now, of course, we're going to define all of these things in a lot more detail when we're in class this week and next week, but we're going to just start with tense for a moment. Eventually, we're going to indicate all of these things in our tree diagrams. We're going to indicate the tense of the verb, mood, if applicable, and aspect, if applicable. At the very minimum, though, we'll always indicate tense. Okay, so tense. This is time, past and present, okay? English only has two tenses, past and present. We don't really have a future tense. Now, that may seem a little surprising to you because you might think, well, I can talk about the future with no problems in English. Yes, you can. You can talk about the future, but it is not a tense. It's actually a mood, and we'll see why in class next week. So, speaking of moods, let's look at mood. Now, as I said before, mood is different purposes for communicating. We're not always just giving information when we talk. Sometimes we're asking a question, or sometimes we're issuing a command or a warning. Sometimes we're talking about possibilities or unreal events or hypothetical situations. And all of these have different structures to the sentence to express these different kinds of purposes. All of these things taken together are what we call mood. Now, another part of a verb phrase sometimes is aspect. You may or may not have aspect. Once again, aspect is a part of the verb's action. So we can focus on the fact that the verb is completed, or we can focus on the fact that the action is currently going on. In other words, we're focusing on the internal components or the ongoing nature of the verb over time. So, let's say, for example, I have this very simple sentence, I eat. Now here we'd say for the tense is present, okay? But now let's start to add some auxiliary verbs. Auxiliary verbs express aspect. They tell us a little bit more specifically about a particular part of the verb. Now in English, we only use the end and the middle. We don't have the beginning. I have eaten is our example sentence here. Now here, it may surprise you, but the tense is actually present. Now, it seems like that's something that happened in the past, right? I have eaten means I'm done. But actually, what you're cluing into more is not so much the time or the tense, but rather the aspect. To say I have eaten means that the action is completed. And that auxiliary have is what's telling us that the action is completed. Not only auxiliary have, but also the verb that comes after it, that it ends in this en form. We have to add that here. So the two of these things together, auxiliary have plus a verb in this form, eaten, give us aspect. And the aspect that it gives us is something called perfect aspect. Perfect just means the action is done. There's a specific endpoint to the action of eating. So, it's perfect. We're done with it. We tied it up in a little bow. If I just say, I ate, past tense, well, that just means sometime in the past it happened, but there's no end point specified to the action of eating when we use it just in the simple past. In contrast, if we have this present perfect, which is what this tense and aspect is, well, that's an event that started in the past and finished very close to the present, but we're focusing on the fact that there is an endpoint. Now, when we contrast that to I had eaten, this is why we have to label I have eaten as present tense. Now, I had eaten definitely in the past. So because we have something that is definitely in the past, we have to have something that is present. We can't label both of these things in the past. The main idea here again, though, is that I had eaten gives us the aspect, perfect aspect. We're focusing on the fact that there's an endpoint to the eating process. It just happened further in the past. Okay. So here, in all instances, the main verb is eat. All other verbs that you see here, have and had, these are all auxiliary verbs. And in particular, these two verbs, have and had, are just versions of auxiliary have. Now, it's important to note that tense shifts to the left as you add more auxiliary verbs. So let's take, for example, our simple present tense sentence, I eat. Now, the tense is carried on the verb eat. And we know that because when we want to change it to past, we change the verb eat, and it becomes I ate. Okay, and now let's say we add an auxiliary. I have eaten. Well, what you'll notice is if we want to change the tense of that, now we don't change eat. Eat stays the same, it's frozen. But we do change the tense of the auxiliary verb. So we get I have eaten or I had eaten. So we're changing the tense. We see the tense moved from eat and it moved on to auxiliary have when we added that. Now we can add more auxiliaries. I may have eaten. Now may and might, these are modal auxiliaries. And it's a little strange to think about these things as having tense, but they do, because the leftmost auxiliary must carry the tense. If you have no auxiliary, it's just carried on the main verb. But the leftmost auxiliary will always carry the tense. So modals, if they're added to any verb phrase, are always going to be the leftmost auxiliary. And so they do have tense. Same thing with have and had. These are the leftmost auxiliary verbs that we have in the sentence. Therefore, they carry the tense. So we can see the tense moving as we add the modal auxiliary here. And what you're going to notice, again, is that we can change this modal auxiliary. You can change it to may have eaten or might have eaten. Doesn't matter. Still, have now is frozen, no longer changes. So that is the rule. Tense shifts to the left as more auxiliary verbs are added. So we can kind of see evidence of this, when we look at ungrammatical sentences in English. For example, I have eat. Well, that's ungrammatical to us. And one reason why that is ungrammatical is because we can't have double tense. We can't have two words that carry tense. And what we're seeing here is I have eat kind of looks like two things are carrying tense, have and eat. And that sounds ungrammatical to us. I also can't say I had ate, or I had eaten. That sounds a little strange. Okay, again, we've got double tense going on here, and that doesn't work for the grammatical system. Now, with the modal auxiliaries, it's even more salient. I cannot say I may have eat. That's ungrammatical. Nor can I say I might had eaten. So I cannot change the form of have in these contexts because it is a frozen form. It no longer has the tense. So the thing that has the tense is the thing that can change. Now, here's the thing about tense. Initially, I said tense equals time, past and present. Well, that's not 100% true. Kinda does, kinda doesn't. Tense only somewhat corresponds to our notions of real world time. And, we can see this from a number of different sentences. So let's take this example. My plane leaves tomorrow. Well, okay, leaves is present tense, but tomorrow seems like the future. Now, remember, I said the future, we don't have a future tense, okay? Nevertheless, we can talk about future events. And so this is something that's often baffling to students who are learning English as a second language. They'll ask me questions like this. Well, I have this verb, or this sentence, it says, my plane leaves, present tense, tomorrow, future. Those two things don't seem to match. Well, okay. In this case, the present moment is actually very broadly construed here to mean the current present, and the imminent future, the not too distant or scheduled future. Okay. More, what we need to consider here is that tense actually corresponds to certainty more than it corresponds to actual real world time. So, if I have a sentence like, my plane leaves tomorrow, well, that's happening very soon. It's the imminent future. And I'm pretty confident. I'm very certain that that's going to happen because it's tomorrow. Now, let's compare this to my plane leaves in 3 months. Now, I asked a group of students at Cal State San Marcos, hey, does this sentence sound okay to you? And about half of them said, yeah, it sounds fine. That's no problem. And about the other half of them were like, no, that doesn't quite sound right. Everybody could say my plane leaves tomorrow. That's all right. But we had a little bit more question marks when it came to my plane leaves in 3 months. So then I presented them with a third sentence. My plane leaves in 3 years. And I asked, how many of you find this acceptable? And nobody raised their hand. So we definitely can't say my plane leaves in 3 years. Most speakers of English would find that unacceptable. Well, why is that? Okay, we can use it for the first instance, but we can't use it the further out in time that we go. And that is because the future is always uncertain. And so we don't want to use the simple present tense for things that are uncertain. We instead are going to use mood for things that are uncertain. And that's when our modal auxiliaries will start to come into play. So we use past and present for things that are certain because when you think about it, you're definitely certain about the past. You saw the past happen. And the present, it's happening right now, or you're very certain that it's going to happen. So we're going to use the present for certain events. So when we think about tense, really tense just kind of changes the physical form of the verb. All right, it inflects verbs. So, we kind of change the equal sign, do away the equal sign, and just say tense kind of equals time. And again, we can see lots of other examples of this, how tense doesn't always match real world time. So for example, if I ask you, what did your neighbor do last night? You could say, well, my neighbor walked her dog. Okay, that's definitely in the past. We're using the past tense. But if I say, what does your neighbor do for exercise? She walks her dog. Oh, is that present? Is that past? Is that future? It's not really exactly occurring right in this moment. But so there doesn't seem to be a real tense associated with that simple present. If we really want to express something that's happening right here, right now, then we're going to use the is walking her dog construction here. So this ing form, walking, expresses another aspect. And this is what we call progressive aspect. Progressive aspect means that we're focusing on the internal structure of the verb. That is that the verb is ongoing over time. And we only get that when we have auxiliary be plus a verb in ing form. So that's actually how we express the simple present. Well, the actual present moment. We don't use the simple present to express the actual present. So we're going to talk a lot more about tense in future classes, and we're going to draw some timelines. It starts to get a little weird and kind of almost sci-fi like when we talk about tense. So we'll definitely do that part in class. Anyway, thanks for listening, and I'll see you all in class on Friday.